Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. Today we are going to look at something that Simon and Tom frequently reference in their podcasts in order to provide further clarity of the subject.
Oh, you mean the Scottish jury system? Yeah,
Right.
particularly the not proven verdict. It's definitely a unique element.
Exactly. So for those of us who might not be as familiar with the Scottish system, can you give us like a quick rundown? What does not proven actually mean? And how is it different from just not guilty?
So in Scotland, you've got three possible verdicts in a criminal trial. Guilty, obviously not guilty, and then this not proven.
Okay.
And both a not guilty and a not proven mean that the person is acquitted. They're free to go.
Right. So what's the difference then?
Well, the difference is really the implication. Not guilty suggests the jury believes that the accused didn't actually commit the crime. But not proven, it kind of suggests that they think the person might be guilty, but they just don't have enough evidence.
Oh, so it's kind of like saying, we don't think you did it, but we're not totally convinced that you didn't do it either.
Oh. Yeah.
Yeah.
A great way to put it. And that's why it's so controversial. Some people see it as extra protection for someone accused of a crime, but others think it's just confusing and maybe even stigmatizing for the people who are acquitted under that verdict.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned the Scottish jury system. It's not like it just appeared overnight, right?
Yeah.
It's got some history to it.
Oh, yeah. Definitely deep historical roots, evolved over centuries. One of the things that makes it so different is this requirement for corroboration.
Corroboration, now what does that involve?
Well, corroboration basically means you need evidence from at least two sources to convict someone, at least in most cases. And it all comes from this worry about how reliable a single witness can be.
Oh, so you're saying that one person's word isn't enough in a Scottish court. That seems pretty strict.
It does, yeah, but the whole idea is to prevent someone from being wrongly convicted based on, like, shaky evidence. If you think about it, memories can be unreliable, or people might have biases, or they could even lie. So this corroboration thing acts as a safety net.
I see. So it's like having two heads are better than one when it comes to evidence in court to make sure they've really got it right.
Exactly. And here's something that I find interesting. This whole concept of needing corroboration, it actually started in civil cases, not criminal ones.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, it seems like early Scottish law was super cautious when someone's property or their money was involved. And then later on, this principle got applied to criminal law, too.
Huh. So they were more worried about messing up civil cases than criminal ones. Interesting.
Well, it might seem strange to us now, but back then, yeah, losing a civil case could be absolutely devastating, like losing your land or your inheritance. That was a big deal.
Yeah, that puts it into perspective for sure. Okay, let's get back to this not proven verdict. So when did this come into play and why?
Well, the not proven verdict, it came about a bit later than some other parts of the system. And its origins are kind of murky, to be honest. There are lots of theories about how it came about and what it was meant for. One really famous legal guy, Baron David Hume, he said that it was supposed to show that there wasn't really enough evidence for a guilty verdict. But it wasn't necessarily saying the person was innocent either.
Oh, so it was like saying, we just don't know for sure, but they didn't totally clear the accused person either.
Yeah, exactly. And this leads to a really interesting question. Does having these two different not guilty verdicts, does it actually change how many people get convicted? Logically, you'd think it shouldn't, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
the jury is supposed to look at all the evidence and decide if the prosecution has proven their case. And then if they haven't, then they pick which not guilty verdict they think is right.
Makes sense in theory, but does it really work that way?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Some experts think that having both options might kind of subconsciously affect jurors, even though they're not supposed to let it. It's like having that not proven there gives them a way out if they're not totally sure.
Yeah, it's almost like a middle ground when they can't decide between guilty and not guilty.
Exactly. And there's research that backs that up. One study actually found that, yeah, having both those not guilty options did seem to change the results, especially when the evidence wasn't super strong either way.
So it's like those cases where it's not totally clear, having that not proven option might make the jury more likely to acquit the person.
It seems that way. It's almost like not proven adds a kind of gray area, A simple not guilty just wouldn't have that.
It's fascinating how just a small change in the wording can change what happens in a trial.
Okay, let's go back to corroboration for a second. It's been a big part of the Scottish system for a long time. A lot of legal professionals, especially the ones who have been around for a while, they see corroboration as this, like, really important way to protect against miscarriages of justice,
Mm.
make sure that the wrong person doesn't get convicted. They argue that it protects against problems with relying on just one person's story. Like, what if their memory isn't accurate or they're biased without even realizing it? Or what if they're lying?
So it's like they'd rather let a few guilty people go free than risk convicting someone who's innocent based on, like, iffy evidence.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. Wrongful convictions are a serious problem, and any system that tries to reduce those is worth thinking about seriously.
Yeah.
This whole corroboration thing, it doesn't just affect what happens in court, it affects the whole system from the very beginning of an investigation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so like police officers, they have to think about whether they can find corroborating evidence before they even report a crime to the procurator fiscal, who's kind of like the public prosecutor in Scotland.
So this need for corroboration, it's a big deal. It affects everything from the beginning to the end.
Absolutely. It's a core principle that just runs through the whole Scottish justice system, but not everyone agrees with it, of course.
Yeah, I was going to say, there must be some people who think this whole corroboration rule is a problem. What are their criticisms?
Well, there are a few, and they do make some good points. One of the main ones is that this need for corroboration, it can actually make it harder to prosecute cases, especially in cases where you do have a believable single witness, but they just don't have any other evidence to back them up.
So you're saying that sometimes this rule that's supposed to protect innocent people ends up helping the guilty ones.
That's exactly what they argue. They see it as a kind of blunt instrument, Like
Yeah.
it can lead to outcomes that aren't really fair. And another thing they say is that the rules around corroboration are super complicated. Like it can be really hard for regular people to understand. Even lawyers and judges sometimes have trouble with it.
So it's not as simple as it might seem at first glance.
Not at all. It can get really tricky, especially in some types of cases. And the critics say that this complexity, it makes it harder for people to get justice.
Yeah, it's like the system's tripping itself up.
Yeah, kind of. And they have some specific examples of where it gets messy. One that's often mentioned is how the system uses distress as corroboration in sexual assault cases.
Wait, so if someone is really upset after an assault, that can be used as evidence against the accused? That doesn't seem right.
Well, it's complicated. It's natural for someone to be distressed after something traumatic like that. But using that distress as evidence to back up their story, it's kind of problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, it gets confusing because you're mixing up a normal reaction to trauma with actual proof of a crime. And what if someone is upset for a completely different reason? That shouldn't be used against the person who's accused. And the second problem is that it puts pressure on the victim to prove how upset they were. And that's really subjective and open to interpretation.
Yeah, it's like saying, you weren't upset enough, so maybe it didn't happen, which is just wrong.
Exactly. It's a very sensitive area, and that's why so many critics say that using distress as corroboration, it's not sensitive, and it's not really reliable either. Another example they bring up a lot is something called the Morov Doctrine.
The Morov Doctrine, what's that?
Well, this doctrine basically says that if someone is accused of a few similar crimes, then the fact that they're accused of those multiple things can actually be used as evidence against them, even if those crimes happened years apart.
Hold on, so you're saying that being accused of multiple things could be used as evidence to convict someone? That doesn't seem right.
I know it can seem a bit circular, right? But the idea behind it is that a pattern of behavior can point to guilt. But the critics say that this can lead to situations where someone is basically convicted because of their past, not because of the evidence in the current case.
Yeah, that does seem risky. What if those past accusations weren't even true or were based on weak evidence?
That's the problem they point out. They say that the Morov Doctrine, while it might be useful sometimes, can also lead to unfair results. They also point to research showing that this whole corroboration thing, it might actually be stopping a lot of cases from even going to trial. And they say this is especially worrying in cases where you have one believable witness, but they just don't have that extra evidence that the system demands. So it's not just about convictions, it's about making sure that people can even get their case heard in the first place.
That's a really important point. So we've got two very different viewpoints here. The people who think corroboration is crucial for fairness and the ones who see it as a roadblock to justice. So how does the Scottish system, with all this stuff about corroboration and not proven, how does it compare to other countries?
Great question. Looking at how they do things in other places can really help us understand this better. So one big difference is that most common law systems, like in England and Wales and Ireland, they've gotten rid of the need for unanimous jury verdicts in criminal trials. So they allow what they call qualified majority verdicts, which means you could have one or two jurors who disagree, but if the majority says guilty, then that's the verdict.
So it's not like in those 12 Angry Men type situations where everyone has to agree completely.
Not anymore, at least not in most places. They changed it because they were worried about things like a juror being pressured or bullied into voting a certain way. So now they figure that allowing a little disagreement on the jury makes it more likely that the result will be fair.
That makes sense, I guess. And what about the size of the juries? Is Scotland the only one with 15 people?
Well, most other places use 12-person juries. That's the most common format. And there's a lot of research that shows that 12-person juries, they're actually pretty good at coming to a just verdict.
Interesting. So it seems like they can handle it just fine. And what about this corroboration rule? Is Scotland the only place that still does that?
Yeah, pretty much. Most other places have either abolished it or they've relaxed it quite a bit. They say that the standard of proof, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, that's enough to protect against wrongful convictions. They don't need this extra strict rule about corroboration on top of that.
So they basically trust their judges and juries to weigh up all the evidence and reach a fair verdict without needing that extra layer of protection.
Yeah, exactly. They have more faith in the system's ability to spot unreliable evidence and to focus on what's really important.
So Scotland is kind of unique in its approach then, with all this emphasis on corroboration and the not proven verdict.
It definitely is. And that's why there's so much debate about whether things should change. There was this big review of the Scottish criminal justice system a few years ago. It was called the Carloway Review, and it was led by the most senior judge in Scotland, Lord Carloway. And this review recommended getting rid of the corroboration requirement altogether.
Wow, so they wanted to get rid of this rule that's been around for centuries. That's a big deal. Why do they want to do that?
Well, the Carloway Review, it basically agreed with a lot of the criticisms we've been talking about. It said that judges and juries should be able to consider all the evidence without being limited by a strict rule like corroboration. And it pointed out all the inconsistencies and problems with how this rule is applied in practice. They basically said that it often causes more trouble than it's worth.
So they were trying to simplify things and give more power to the legal professionals to use their judgment.
Yeah, that was part of it. The review also suggested making the appeals process more efficient. They said that exceptions to the time limits for appeals should only be allowed in very specific cases, but they still wanted to keep the general right to appeal with the court's permission.
So they wanted to make the whole appeals process faster and more focused.
That's right. The idea was to protect the rights of people who've been convicted while also making sure that the system works efficiently and doesn't get bogged down in unnecessary appeals.
So much to think about with how the Scottish system works and how different it is from other places. What are the main things our listeners should take away from all of this, especially those who are familiar with the cases that Simon and Tom cover?
Well, one thing that's really interesting is how much the Scottish system focuses on being careful. They really want to avoid convicting the wrong person, even if it means that sometimes a guilty person might go free. The corroboration requirement and the not proven verdict are both examples of that.
It's like they're saying, we'd rather be safe than sorry, even if it means that some guilty people might get away with it, which is a bit of a sensitive topic, I guess. But anyway, these calls for changes to the system, especially getting rid of corroboration, it really makes you wonder, should Scotland update its approach? Or is there something valuable in this traditional focus on caution?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that's going to be debated for a long time, I think. Will Scotland keep doing things the way they've always done them? Or will they decide to change? Only time will tell. But it's definitely a topic that's going to keep legal experts talking.
And I'm sure it'll give Simon and Tom lots to discuss on their podcast. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty of how all this actually works in a real trial. What happens in a Scottish courtroom?
Okay, well, imagine you're sitting in a courtroom in Scotland watching a criminal trial. The first thing you'd notice is the jury. It has 15 people, which is more than the 12 you usually see on TV.
So a bigger jury than we're used to. That means they're getting a wider range of viewpoints, I guess.
Exactly. And remember, they need to reach a majority verdict. So at least 8 of them have to agree on whether it's guilty, not guilty, or not proven. The trial itself follows a pretty similar structure to other common law systems. So the prosecution, they present their case first. They call witnesses and show evidence to try to prove that the accused person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
And this is where the corroboration rule comes in, right?
Yeah.
They have to back up everything they say with evidence from multiple sources.
That's right. And the defense lawyers are watching everything very closely, looking for any weaknesses in the prosecution's case. Like any times where they haven't met that corroboration requirement, they can object to evidence and question witnesses and try to poke holes in the prosecution's story.
It sounds like a real battle between the two sides, with each one trying to convince the jury that their version of events is the truth.
It is. It's a real battle of legal strategy. And here's another unique thing about the Scottish system. The accused person, they don't have to testify if they don't want to. It's the prosecution's job to prove their case, and the accused has the right to remain silent the whole time.
It's pretty different from what we see in America, where defendants often do take the stand to give their side of the story.
Yeah, it is. And it reflects that core idea in the Scottish system that we've been talking about. The idea of being very cautious and careful. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. It's their job to prove the person is guilty, not the other way around.
They start with this idea that the person is innocent until proven guilty.
Exactly. It's a system that's built to protect the accused person, even if it means that it might be harder for the prosecution to get a conviction.
Fascinating. So after both sides have presented their arguments, the jury goes off to deliberate and make a decision. What goes on in that room?
Well, we can only imagine, right? We don't get to see what happens behind closed doors, but we can guess based on what we know about how juries work and the psychology of decision-making. So those 15 jurors, they have to go through all the evidence and think about whether the witnesses were believable and ultimately decide if they think the accused is guilty, not guilty, or not proven.
And having that not proven option, I guess that must make their discussions even more complicated.
Oh, for sure. It adds a whole other level of complexity. It's a gray area that you wouldn't have if there were just two verdicts. Like, they might all agree that the prosecution hasn't proven the case beyond a reasonable doubt, but some of them might not be comfortable saying not guilty either.
So not proven becomes a kind of compromise verdict, a way for them to say, we're not sure.
Yeah, you could say that. And the research shows that having this third option, it actually does influence how juries decide, especially in those cases where the evidence isn't clear-cut. It gives them a way to kind of hedge their bets, so to speak.
It's like the system acknowledges that sometimes there isn't a clear answer, and the verdict reflects that uncertainty.
Exactly. And that ambiguity, it can have big consequences for everyone involved. The accused person goes free, but their reputation might still be damaged. And the victim, they might feel like they haven't gotten justice.
It shows how, even with a system that's supposed to be fair, sometimes things don't end neatly.
That's one of the big challenges with any legal system, right? It's trying to achieve justice, but it's still a human system, and humans aren't perfect.
It reminds us that laws are made by people, and people make mistakes.
Very true. But trying to achieve justice, even with all the challenges, it's still a really important thing to do.
Absolutely. The Scottish system, with its unique features, it gives us a lot to think about in terms of how societies deal with crime and punishment.
Definitely. And the debate about whether to change the system, it shows just how significant these issues are.
It really does. So let's dig a little deeper into the arguments for and against keeping this corroboration rule. What are the main points that each side makes?
Okay, well, the people who want to keep corroboration, they usually talk about how it's important for fairness to the accused person. They say that when the government has so much power to investigate and prosecute people, it's really important to have protections in place to prevent innocent people from being convicted.
So it's about making sure that the accused person has a fighting chance against the power of the state.
Right. They argue that corroboration acts as a check on the prosecution. It forces them to build a really strong case with evidence from different sources instead of just relying on one person's word. They're basically saying if you're going to take away someone's freedom, you better have more than just one person's story to back it up.
That makes sense. It adds a lot of weight to the whole process.
It does. They see this as a fundamental part of a fair trial and something that helps protect innocent people. And they also argue that corroboration helps to make sure that the evidence used in court is good quality and reliable.
So it's like a built-in quality control system for the evidence.
Yeah, you could say that. In their view, this careful approach to evidence is crucial for keeping public faith in the justice system. They believe people are more likely to trust verdicts that are based on solid, corroborated evidence than on a single person's account, which might not be as reliable.
So it's not just about fairness to the accused person. It's about making sure that the whole system is seen as trustworthy.
Right. And of course, they also point to the long history of corroboration in Scottish law. They
Right.
say it's a tradition that's worked well for them and has contributed to a justice system that's known for being fair and protecting the rights of the accused.
So there's a sense of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Exactly. They think that Scotland should be very careful before getting rid of something that's been so important to their legal system for so long.
That's understandable. But I know there's also a strong counter-argument. What about the people who want to abolish corroboration? What are their main points?
Well, the people who want to get rid of corroboration, they say that the current system is too inflexible, too complicated, and it makes it harder for justice to be served. While they agree that the idea behind corroboration is good, they think it often prevents cases with good evidence from even going to trial, especially when there's one believable witness, but they don't have any other evidence to back up their story.
So they're saying that this rule, which is supposed to protect innocent people, can actually lead to another kind of injustice, the guilty people getting away with it because there isn't enough evidence.
That's a really good way to put it. They argue that the system as it stands is too biased in favor of the accused person. And they say this imbalance can have serious consequences for the victims of crime. They point to cases where people who've committed domestic abuse or sexual assault or other crimes have been acquitted because the system demands a level of proof that's really hard to meet in those types of cases.
So it's like this well-intentioned rule can end up protecting criminals and letting them get away with what they've done.
Yeah, and that's a powerful argument. And it's one that resonates with a lot of people, especially those who've been victims of crime themselves. They feel let down by the very system that's supposed to protect them. It's like the system cares more about the rights of the accused person than about getting justice for the victim.
And that feeling of being let down by the system, of having their experiences ignored, must be incredibly frustrating and upsetting.
It is. And another big point they make is that the rules around corroboration are just too complicated and they're not applied consistently. You remember we talked about the Moroff doctrine and how distress can be used as corroboration?
Yeah, those were some of the more confusing parts.
Right. Well, the people who want to get rid of corroboration, they say that all this complexity just causes confusion, makes it harder to predict what will happen in a case, and can even lead to unfair results. They think that a simpler system that gives judges and juries more freedom to decide what evidence is believable would be fairer and more efficient.
So basically, they want to streamline things, get rid of unnecessary rules, and trust the legal professionals to make good judgments.
Exactly. They say that judges and juries should be able to decide whether a single witness is telling the truth without being bound by this rigid rule. And they think this would mean that more cases could actually be heard and decided fairly instead of being thrown out because of a technicality.
So they're all about trusting the people in the legal system to do their jobs properly.
That's a good way to put it. They think this approach would lead to a more just system overall, one that's better equipped to deal with all the complexities of modern crime. And finally, they argue that getting rid of corroboration would bring Scotland more in line with other countries that have modern legal systems. Remember how we talked about how most other common law systems have already moved away from this requirement?
Yeah, it seems like Scotland's a bit behind the times on this one.
Yeah, they are kind of an outlier in this regard. And the people who want to change things, they say that this makes Scotland look outdated and like they're not keeping up with how the rest of the world thinks about law. They believe that adopting a more flexible approach to evidence would make Scotland's justice system more respected internationally.
So it's not just about fairness within Scotland itself. It's about how they're seen by the rest of the world.
Exactly. They think that reforming the corroboration rule would send a strong message that Scotland is serious about justice and that they're committed to having a fair, modern, and efficient legal system.
So we've got two very different sides to this argument, each with strong points to make. It really shows how tricky it is to balance all the different values that are involved in any legal system.
It does, and this debate is going to continue for a while, I think. The Scottish government has a tough decision to make. They need to figure out how to move forward in a way that addresses everyone's concerns and ultimately serves the cause of justice.
It's a big responsibility, and whatever they decide will have long-lasting effects on how justice is carried out in Scotland. It's clear that the system is designed to be very careful and to protect the rights of the accused, even if that means some guilty people might go free. But the people who are calling for change, they highlight how all this caution can also create its own set of problems, and it might actually make it harder for victims to get justice.
It's a constant balancing act, right? And the choices that are made in the next few years in Scotland are going to have a big impact on how justice works there. It's a really crucial moment for their legal system.
It really is. Now, while we're waiting to see what happens with all of that, let's look at how these rules and procedures affect real-life cases. You said before that the corroboration rule can make it really tough to prosecute certain types of crimes. Can you give us some examples?
Sure. One area where this rule has caused a lot of controversy is in domestic abuse cases. A lot of times, these cases involve a pattern of controlling behavior and violence that happens behind closed doors. So there are no witnesses except for the victim and the abuser.
So it becomes a situation where it's just one person's word against the other, and it's almost impossible to prove what really happened.
Exactly. And that's where the corroboration rule becomes a huge problem. The victim might have physical injuries and be traumatized and have a consistent story about what happened. But without that second piece of evidence, it can be really difficult to build a case that meets the legal requirements.
So you're saying that this rule, which is meant to protect innocent people, can actually end up protecting abusers.
That's what the people who want to reform the system argue. They say that this rule gives abusers a free pass because they know it'll be hard to prosecute them. And this can have terrible consequences for victims because they feel like the system is failing them.
It's like the system is saying, we won't believe you unless you can find someone to back up your story.
Yeah, and that's a valid concern. It shows how the system can actually hurt the people it's supposed to be helping. And this isn't just a problem in domestic abuse cases. It happens in sexual assault cases, too.
I imagine it's the same issue there with the lack of witnesses and the difficulty of proving whether there was consent or not.
Exactly. Sexual assaults often happen in private with no one else around. And even when you have physical evidence like DNA, it doesn't tell the whole story. It might show that there was sexual contact, but it can't tell you if it's consensual or not.
So even with scientific evidence, the corroboration rule can still prevent justice from being done.
That's right. And it's very frustrating for victims. Imagine going through something traumatic, then having to go through all the invasive procedures of a forensic exam, only to be told that nothing can be done because there isn't enough evidence. It's like the system is saying, your word and your trauma aren't enough for us to believe you.
That must be incredibly disheartening for victims to hear.
It is. And when victims aren't believed, it can discourage other people from coming forward. They might be afraid that they won't be believed either, and that the system will fail them too.
It's a reminder that even with well-intentioned rules, there can be unintended consequences. The corroboration rule, which is meant to protect the innocent, can actually end up silencing victims and allowing the guilty to get away with what they've done.
Exactly. And that's why the people who are calling for reform, they say that Scotland needs to find a better balance between the rights of the accused and the rights of the victims. They want a system that truly serves everyone.
It's a really complex issue with no easy solutions.
That's right. It's one of the fundamental challenges of any legal system, trying to make sure that justice is done, while also recognizing that no system is perfect and that sometimes mistakes will be made.
It reminds us that the law is ultimately a human system with all its flaws and limitations.
That's very true. But it's still important to keep striving for justice even within those limitations.
Definitely. And the debate in Scotland about this corroboration rule, it makes us think about how we can always be working to improve our legal systems.
It does. It's about finding the right balance between protecting individual rights and making sure that justice is served. It's a really important discussion that's happening all over the world. It's about what justice means, how to balance different interests, and how to create legal systems that are fair, effective, and work for everyone.
That's a really good point. It reminds us that we all have a part to play in making the world a more just place.
Absolutely. In the end, the pursuit of justice is something we all have a responsibility for.
So what are the main things our listeners should remember from our conversation today, especially when they're thinking about the cases that Simon and Tom cover?
Well, one important thing to keep in mind is the context of the Scottish legal system. It's a system that's built on being cautious, and it prioritizes protecting the accused, even if that means some guilty people might go free. So when you're listening to Simon and Tom talk about a case, don't just focus on whether you think the person is guilty or not. Try to see it from the perspective of the Scottish legal system. Ask yourself, did the prosecution prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt within the rules of this particular system?
So it's about trying to be objective and not just relying on your own gut feelings.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this corroboration rule, it really affects how investigations and prosecutions are done in Scotland. The police and the prosecutors have to be very careful to build a case that meets this specific standard, and sometimes that can limit what they can do.
So we shouldn't always assume that the police are being incompetent or lazy. They might be doing the best they can within a system that has a lot of rules and restrictions.
That's a good point. The corroboration rule can make their job a lot harder, especially when there isn't much physical evidence or when people are afraid to come forward as witnesses.
So it's a reminder to be patient and understanding.
Absolutely. And another thing to remember is the potential impact of that not proven verdict. We talked about how it can be a bit confusing and unsatisfying for both the accused person and the victim. The accused person might be free to go, but their name isn't necessarily cleared. And the victim might not feel like they've gotten justice.
It shows how the legal system, even when it's trying its best, can't always give people the closure or the clear-cut answers they might be hoping for.
That's very true. And I think it's important to approach these cases with empathy and understanding for everyone involved. The legal system tries to be objective, but it's still dealing with real people and their experiences.
And lastly, our listeners should keep in mind that there's this big debate going on about reforming the Scottish justice system, especially about getting rid of the corroboration rule. It's a debate that's not going away anytime soon, and whatever Scotland decides to do will have a major impact on how justice is done in their country.
It's definitely a situation to keep an eye on. The Scottish justice system is at a crossroads, and the decisions they make now will affect how things work for many years to come.
What a fascinating and complex topic this has been. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and helping us to understand the ins and outs of the Scottish justice system.
It's been my pleasure. These are important things to talk about.
They really are. And I'm sure our listeners are going to be really interested to hear what Simon and Tom have to say about all this on their podcast. I know I am.
Me too. I'm sure they'll have some great insights.
I'm sure they will. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Scottish justice system.
It's been great talking with you.
This will give Simon and Tom lots to talk about in their weekly review on Sunday. But in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.